Hello, everyone, and welcome to Alta Journal's California Book Club. It's a thrill to be here tonight for Pulitzer Prize winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen, special guest Don McKellar, who co-show ran and co-wrote the HBO Max miniseries The Sympathizer, and novelist Ramana Alam, who also had a book adapted by a streaming service, Netflix. And of course, our host John Freeman, who was working the night shift this evening from London. My name is Blaise Zariga. I'm Alta Journal's editorial director. We're grateful for everyone's understanding and flexibility that allowed us to reschedule tonight's event from 2 weeks ago as we've confronted the devastating LA fires and other unforeseen circumstances. Several people on the Alta team, our contributors, our readers, and of course the people of Los Angeles have been deeply affected. We're heartbroken for those who've lost loved ones, their homes, and their jobs. But despite these circumstances, and perhaps even as a testament to the power of California literature, we've got a big crowd tonight. So we're really excited to get together with everyone. So I encourage folks, please reach out in the chat and say where they're joining from, maybe share some kind words of greeting too. I'm Zooming tonight from San Francisco. And while you're doing that and getting to know each other a little bit, I'm going to take care of some housekeeping. Tonight's event is part of the California Book Club, Alta's free monthly gathering celebrating the Golden State's writers and writing. In the weeks leading up to each club meeting, altaonline.com publishes numerous articles about that month's pick. If you haven't had a chance to read them, I'd encourage you to go to our website and do so. Check out the fantastic essays by our host, John Freeman, editors Anita Felicelli and David Yulin, as well as an excerpt, a cocktail recipe. It's called a mango shrub, I think, and even a crossword. There's so much good stuff there. And all these articles are included in the California Book Club newsletter, which is also free. You should be getting it. We also have several other newsletters that you may want to sign up for. Trust me, you're going to love what we do. Also, fun fact, every CBC episode, California Book Club gathering, is available on our site for free for watching. So go back and check them out. We've been doing this for 3 years now. This club would not be possible without the amazing support of our partners. I'd like to thank the Los Angeles Public Library, San Francisco Public Library, the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West, Book Passage, Book Soup, Camino Books, Vromans, Books Inc., Green Apple Books, Bookshop West Portal, Narrative Magazine, and Zizabah. And so please support our partners, visit these indie bookstores and buy some books. Buy a copy of The Sympathizer or another one of Viet's books, The Man with Two Faces. Already have a copy? Pick one up for a friend. And while you're at it, please think about supporting the work we do by becoming a member of Alta Journal. You can just visit altaonline.com, easy to sign up. Tonight, California Book Club members, we have a special treat. Enjoy an exclusive 25% off discount on Alta's all-access subscription. You'll get award-winning stories, ad-free digital access, and a free Altitude cartoon collection for just $37.50 a year. Plus, we have another special offer for tonight's attendees. Show your love, your California Book Club pride with our stylish tote bag. Use this code CBC_tote. This will all be in the chat at checkout, and you get 25% off this really great tote bag. It's really high quality. And so please sign up tonight. And one last sell for $3 a month if you can also become a digital member or visit our website. And here's our current issue. You'll see it's a large format, oversized, beautiful publication. In this issue, we've got an interview with Viet by David Yulin. Each quarter, we highlight the upcoming CBC authors. We also have a special folio, Alta Folio by Rick Bass, talking about when he played semi-pro football at the age of 60. It's a pullout. It's a real keepsake. It's beautiful. And if you buy from our site, it's tax-free and free shipping on magazines. There's also lots of other cool merch. So please check it out. And again, I'm so happy to everyone is here tonight. It promises to be a wonderful evening. And so let me introduce this and turn this microphone over to tonight's California Book Club host, John Freeman.
Thanks, Blaise. Hello, everybody. I hope everyone's well and safe, and that your families are well and safe wherever you are. when we started this book club 4 years ago, we were just trying to keep things going during another difficult time. But we also wanted to celebrate California literature. And more than that, we wanted to look at books which showed us new ways to tell stories, books that took broken narratives and came up with more complex and true narratives to what happened in the world. We wanted to find books that found new ways of experiencing beauty and relationships and love that played with genre. And we wanted to find books that also taught us how or showed us how to remember, to be true to how memory actually works. And that is one of the key themes of the life and the work of Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is our guest tonight. He wrote in one of his books, all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And that's not something he's just thought about, it's something he's lived. Born in 1971 in Vietnam, his family fled after the fall of Saigon in 1975 to the US, wound up in various parts of Pennsylvania and eventually San Jose, where he grew up. His parents ran a grocery store. He fell in love with writing early. He bounced around various universities and wound up at Berkeley, thank God, because man, did he get a good education. And someone lit the fire in him. We'll talk about this tonight. And it is an extraordinary thing to watch a slow fire burn, because from 2015 to this year, the last 10 years, he has published 9 books, including the one we're going to talk about tonight, The Sympathizer, his debut novel, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, but also Nothing Ever Dies, which is an extraordinary nonfiction book about war and memory, about the war in Vietnam and how it's remembered by Americans and how it is experienced differently around the world. He published a book of short stories called The Refugees. He published an anthology about writing by refugees called The Displaced. He published 2 children's books, Chicken of the Sea and Simone. He published a book that is like a memoir but isn't a memoir called A Man of Two Faces, a sequel to The Sympathizer called The Committed. And this spring, he's got a new book called To Save and Destroy, Writing as the Other, which is a series of lectures he gave at Harvard about Ralph Ellison and other figures in his life. And I think one of the things that Viet does in his work probably better than anyone alive is just turn optics around and look back at how stories are told, look back at how America tells stories about itself, and especially look back at how America tells stories about Vietnam. And the book that really launched that is the novel we're talking about tonight, The Sympathizer, a narrative story by a man who's in prison, who's a double agent for the Viet Cong, who's come to America after the fall of Saigon to watch the Vietnamese refugees who've come here, the South Vietnamese, to report on them, but he is also reporting on America, and he's reporting on himself. It's one of the best novels, I think, of the last 25 years, for sure. It's one of those books, when you read it, like Beloved, like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, you will never forget having read it, and it will mess with the way you think in the best possible ways. Please join me in welcoming Viet Thanh Nguyen. Thanks,
Hi,
Viet.
Tom. Hi, thanks for that really incredible introduction. Such an honor to be here talking with you in front of all of the guests here tonight.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to have you. And since we have you plus Don McKellar and Rumaan Alam, I'm going to start talking, just jump right in at the deep end. With the title of this book, The Sympathizer, in Nothing Ever Dies, you wrote something along the lines of sympathy is a dangerous thing. It enables identification with others, but also the potential to consume others. And I wonder if you could talk about that in light of this novel and the character and what that danger means for him and what it means for the characters around him, because the word sympathy, to sympathize, is not just used for the captain, the narrator, the sort of double agent. It's used for many of the other people he meets, including women.
I mean, sympathy is such a complex emotion, and obviously, for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, we think sympathy is something positive and necessary. But there are limits to sympathy. I mean, it allows us access to other people's imagination and to other people's feelings, which is great for those of us who are writers and artists. And it's obviously also necessary for doing things like taking political action. But sympathy itself is an emotion that's not necessarily an action. You could sympathize and yet not do anything. Or you could sympathize and do something like be a writer or an artist and have access to other people's characters and so on, and yet still be a terrible human being. So I wanted to use that idea of sympathy and get into the complexities and the contradictions of it, its necessity, but also its limitations and its dangers, and embed those feelings in the character of someone who is literally a sympathizer. And to show, how that emotion drives him, but also puts him squarely in harm's way as well, both as someone who is going to commit crimes, but as someone who, because of his sympathy for the downtrodden and the oppressed, will find himself being targeted by others as well.
What you describe is a very complex moral field. He's always making judgments about what's possible, who's doing what, what's at risk for him. But he is, as the book goes along, he has this sort of tidal wave of regret and guilt to some degree, and it fans out in unexpected ways around him. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your background, if you will, your moral upbringing, and what instilled that in you? What gave you the ability to feel those complexities as a storyteller? Because just because you can tell a story doesn't mean you can set a moral sphere in orbit the way that you have here.
I give all credit to the library, the public library, for giving me the opportunity to be steeped in stories and in feelings in that way, and getting in, by immersing myself in those fictions that I was reading as a kid. I think I sort of started to learn intuitively the demands of empathizing with characters. But the other really important part of my life was my parents, who were very devout Catholics and raised me in a very devout Catholic environment, sending me to Catholic school almost my entire life, making me go to Catholic church every weekend, sending me to Vietnamese Catholic Sunday school. And it didn't work in one way because I came out an atheist, but it worked in another way in the sense that I came out of that education and that upbringing with a really sincere conviction in the idea of social justice as I understood it in the biblical narratives that I was being taught. And so that sense of justice, of the necessity for taking care of the weaker, of empathizing with the losers, and so on, that was a part of the biblical story that I took out of my experience, and I took the Bible for its word. I took my Jesuit priests, I took the everybody else that I encountered who were Catholics, I took them at their word. And so I think even if the practice of the Catholic Church has oftentimes been disastrous in regards to the poor and the downtrodden and the colonized, the spirit of it that I took away from it was really crucial for that. And I've tried to carry that, I think somehow that sense of justice has become embedded in me, so that I'm naturally polemical. I'm naturally oriented towards politics. Went to Berkeley, and I think Berkeley offered this sort of secular version of the notion of social justice that really drew me in and instantly, allowed me to take the religious part of my upbringing and turn it into a secular, materialist, literary, cultural version of it.
Well, this book is a confession. It begins with him sort of, in these immortal lines, but as the book goes along, he each chapter sometimes interrupts and he's back at the confession. And of course, it ends with him trying to give a confession again. And I felt, and this read is my third time through the book, that it is a very spiritual book. It's a spy thriller, it's a war novel. It lambasts, makings of Vietnam War movies, but it also, there's a spiritual element that is often not talked about. And I wonder if there's anything you could say about that.
I mean, the book, I think, work tries to take every element of itself and make it multi-layered. So the sympathizer and sympathy has a couple of different dimensions, and then therefore so does the dimension of belief in spirituality. I think the novel at one point says, or maybe I say it somewhere else, but Catholics and communists are very similar. They're both communities based on this uncompromising sense of belief and faith in something that people are willing to martyr themselves for and sacrifice themselves for. And so, we're used to talking more about religion as a form of spirituality, but I also think of writing and politics as forms of spiritual faith as well, done in different ways. And so the idea of the confession really allowed me to, I think, bring all of that together, because confession is obviously important in the Catholic tradition. Confession is important in the Marxist and communist traditions as well. In both senses, you have to confess your sins, confess your failures in order to improve yourselves and improve yourself in the eyes of whoever is your mentor. And then finally, the confession is a literary form. People have to write confessions, whether it's, the confessions of St. Augustine or the confessions of re-education camp prisoners, or in some cases, the confessions of writers. So that notion of the confession really allowed me to touch on all these different forms of spirituality and regret. That was part of your earlier question, and I think just want to go back to that really quickly and say one of the other reasons why I wanted to write this novel was because I grew up in the 70s and 80s with this sense that my life had taken a particular direction because of my parents and their ability to escape from Vietnam. But what if I'd been born earlier? What if we had not been able to leave Vietnam? How would I confront the political and moral choices that an earlier generation had to confront as Vietnamese people had dealt with colonialism and the presence of the French and the Americans and had to make difficult, terrible choices? Would I have been capable of making those choices? And if I had made those choices, what kinds of ambivalences and regrets would I have had, even if I felt that I had done the right thing? So the novel is really born from that, from my trying to answer those sets of questions for myself.
Well, you really feel it when you're reading it, and you feel it especially so as the book goes along and your main character gets lured into some actions that he really regrets immediately and is kind of haunted by in ways that echo some of the short stories you published before this book, Ghosts Appear. But also, he starts to get roped into a film project of making a film about the war in Vietnam, and he thinks maybe I can correct maybe I can make good on my existence in the world by at least getting some better representations into this film. And it becomes this boondoggle of a sort. And I wonder if you could read a little bit from the novel, because it's sort of this moment where you confront, to some degree, the myth-making machine that you're writing against head on.
Sure. I mean, I grew up steeped in Hollywood movies in general, but also very specifically about the war in Vietnam. And I thought that writing this novel would be my opportunity to get revenge on Hollywood for everything it had done to Vietnam and the Vietnamese people and to myself as a young and confused spectator. So I'm going to read a passage where our spy, our protagonist, is meeting this famous Hollywood director named only as the auteur for the first time. And they're going to discuss this Hollywood script that he has written called The Hamlet, which is a movie that is sort of like Apocalypse Now, but is also really mostly about all of Hollywood's Vietnam War movies. And The Hamlet is about American Green Berets who are being sent to Vietnam to train the so-called Montagnards to fight communists. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? I said. You know what I mean. Ching Chong English? Just to pretend they are speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question. What was it? Oh, yes. How many movies have you made? None. Isn't that right? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas. He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How can I be so deluded? Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country In order to exploit it, Hollywood was much more efficient, imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created. With all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb.
I love that section. And I want to bring on Don McKellar, the actor, playwright, filmmaker, and showrunner for the adaptation of The Sympathizer, which ran on HBO. The limited series, a man of bravery and style, and a profoundly amazing adaptation that you've made. But surely, I'm going to let you take it away with Viet here. But that is either you read that and thought, "Wow, this is someone I'm going to work with, or someone I'm going to listen
It's okay
to."
if I'm smiling like this. I've never really seen Viet perform like that. I'm amazed. I wish I could. If I'd seen him perform, I might have been more intimidated. I'd never seen him play the parts before, but yeah, that was fantastic, Viet.
Well, maybe you should have cast me in the TV series.
I know we did cast you, but
I got half a second, I
obviously
think.
a bigger part was required. Yeah, I mean, I love that section.
So what was the most difficult part of adapting the novel into a series?
I mean, I think I mean, I loved the book. I read it very quickly. I was thrilled by it. I found it really fresh. And yet at the same time, I really identified it, even though it's obviously very different from my experience. But and it was full of incidents because I was reading it for adaptation. I was thinking it's full of big set pieces, it's full of comic set pieces, dramatic set pieces. So that was all there. The characters were great, but I think my biggest concern was what also turned out to be your biggest concern when we met, was the actual voice of the book, which is so distinctive in ways you've just been talking about. And it's essential to the seductive power of the book that it draws you in. He's a bit of a raconteur, but as John was saying, over time you start questioning his judgment and questioning his morality. That's a very hard thing to achieve with a visual medium. So that was my biggest concern.
Yeah, well, my biggest concern was just working within this gigantic machinery of Hollywood. I mean, making a movie of any kind, it's already a big enterprise because you're working with dozens of people, hundreds in our case. I think it was like 400 people altogether at any one point.
Yeah.
And then, of
Oh
course,
yeah, I mean that goes without saying that I did feel this is a challenging book no matter what, and no matter what HBO says and what all our great producers say, it's going to be challenging in lots of ways. We wanted to keep the Vietnamese language in itself present and alive. That was going to be a challenge, we knew. And yeah, it was going to be a big diplomatic challenge, I knew, as a showrunner. So of course that was a big concern too. Yeah.
it was interesting. I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of diplomacy being carried around inside the production. You're working with many, many different personalities and talents, and we had so many brilliant people working on it. But then, of course, there was also the diplomacy of just trying to get this thing made in the context of the politics of Vietnam, which was very, very complicated. You know, we tried to shoot in Vietnam, but we couldn't do it. For a number of complicated reasons, you know, like maybe the government would say we were gonna let you do it, but we just couldn't get around to it in time. And maybe from our perspective, they really were never going to let us shoot
Yes.
in Vietnam.
They might have been just stringing us along to keep anyone else from doing it. I mean, yeah, it's very complicated. And you're right. When I said diplomacy, I meant with with our studio and with our producers, but that was head-on diplomacy. We were talking directly with the Vietnamese government and the Censor Bureau and the culture ministers and trying to pull strings. And yeah, it was frankly very disappointing. We couldn't shoot in Vietnam, which is, it would have been amazing just to actually use the real locations, and it would have been much easier to cast and much easier in every level. But as you know, but maybe the club members don't know, the book is very controversial over there. Apparently, I'm not allowed to say it's banned, but it's not publishable. Isn't that true?
Yeah, well, we've had a publishing arrangement since 2016, I believe, in
Yeah.
Vietnam. And, the backstory behind that is, that was arranged at the very highest levels because,
Yeah.
I came to know the son-in-law of the Vietnamese prime minister, who is a Vietnamese American, that is a son-in-law. And that was where we initially got the publishing deal through those kinds of connections. And then the prime minister lost power in the next election.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the new regime in place since then has been much more hardline about things like opening up to
Yeah, they
different
backtracked
ideas.
on a lot of
Yeah.
cultural levels too. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I bought back the translation. So in fact, we are going to publish the translation.
Because the translation is good, isn't it? Like the
The
Vietnamese.
translation is supposedly
Yeah.
good. The limitation is the contract says we can publish this Vietnamese translation everywhere except Vietnam. So,
Yeah. Well, and
but
of course we weren't officially able to broadcast in Vietnam either, which is a shame because although everyone has seen it, every Vietnamese person I've talked to has seen it, so and read the book. So
yeah.
it's a shame. But I mean, I console myself by saying that really one of my chief aims was to show it to America. I mean, I feel it's an important show for America to see, and the whole sort of hook, if I can be crass, of the book and the show is to show Americans the side of the war they haven't seen, and the side of the history that
I just don't know if Americans want to see it. I mean, it's like,
that's
okay. I mean, so for example, I just spent a lot of time watching a Star Wars series called Andor, which is actually a really good series,
right.
but it's
I
both
haven't seen
entertainment and it's actually about revolution, and
right.
the mechanics of revolution. And I think that people are willing to watch that because the politics are remote. You can see a whole
Yes.
revolution unfold and it's remote, and you're not implicated because if you when I watch it, I'm thinking, oh, the empire is the United States and the UK and the West. And the rebels are like basically people of color and the colonized. If
Yes.
you're watching it as an American, you're like, oh, I'm part of the rebels. I'm identifying with that.
Yes.
But when you watch The Sympathizer, there's not that allowance. There's not that cushion of fantasy that's allowed for a Western or a white viewer. You are the white people in the TV series, and you are confronting a history that's not that far distant. And so I think that, The Sympathizer is, as a TV series, my read of it is that it's still a challenging experience at the level of entertainment for a lot of people who don't want their entertainment to be too provocative.
Yes, I mean, well, obviously it is that edge is what makes it relevant, and that is in one hand what makes it interesting, and I think and provocative for people to take the challenge, but that's also off-putting for people who don't. So, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, I mean, it is sadly relevant in lots of ways, and from when I started working on it, people would always call me up and say, "Oh, this is just like the Sympathizer. What's happening in the world, or a withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's just like the Sympathizer." And I always feel that when you read the history after the Vietnam War, there were all these articles and books saying this is a turning point in American foreign policy. We have to remember the lessons of the Vietnam War, and it didn't really stick, those lessons.
Yeah, I think that's what's depressing. I mean, I'm teaching my class on the American War in Vietnam in memory to students who were all, I think, all born after 9/11, actually.
Yeah,
We're now talking ancient history. The end of the Vietnam War was 50 years ago this
yeah,
year.
yeah, literally.
So that means that for someone like me, when I put that into context, I was born in 1971. That would be 1921. That's almost World War
Yeah,
One,
yeah, it's
right?
shocking, I
Oh,
know.
it's so shocking. And so the generation that grew up fighting in or witnessing or protesting against the Vietnam War, for them it's a living history, but for the current generation, it's history. Um, uh, and I just can't help but feel that, in fact, many of the horrifying lessons that supposedly the West was supposed to take away from the war in Vietnam have been completely repurposed, contained, sanitized,
Yes.
so on for the purposes of new global wars on the part of a renewed United States. And
Well,
it's
as you know, America's very actively, the new project is rewriting history again. So I mean, yeah, and I mean, I think the Vietnam War is also, it was really the first war with this cultural crux of popular culture. It was the most so documented uh, and it was so tied up with American movies and literature. I still think more than any other war, which makes it even more alive and active in a certain way. Still, I think it's the one we reference.
Yeah, but, I just think the point needs to be driven home. So that's why I had to write a sequel called The Committed. That goes to France in the 1980s to talk about French colonization and the
Yes.
Algerian War's legacy. And I'm about to leave very soon to go to El Salvador, so that the third novel begins in El Salvador.
Yeah.
Because
Well, that was the first kind of the next mistake.
yeah, I came across a phrase I hadn't seen before. El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. And
Right.
the pictures that I've seen are, showing Salvadoran military people. They look like American soldiers in Vietnam. They're flying
Yeah.
Huey helicopters, or wearing American military uniforms. They're applying military American counterinsurgency tactics to Salvadoran peasants. And, so for me, the sympathizer was always going to be a part of this larger commentary about the centrality of war to the United States, but also to other countries. And the challenge of that very depressing topic is also to make it entertaining at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Well,
that's,
that's what you do. That's your thing, I feel. I mean, on top of all that, the book is so so entertaining. I mean, that's the other thing I wanted to capture in the show. And what I was so amazed about the book was just how entertaining, how funny it was, how lively it was. And I can't really think of a book that is really a polemical book that has big ideas, but that are that you wield with such, dexterity, and it's so fun. I mean, that's what I feel your great gift is, in a way. So I look forward to the third, that's for sure.
Well,
Well,
get Neve to share some of your adaptation.
yeah, maybe there will be a second and a third series.
Yeah, we'll see.
Don, thank you so much. It's really a treat to have you here.
My
There's a lot
pleasure.
of
I'm glad.
love and support for the series in the comment queue. And there's a lot of questions coming in for you, Viet, not just about the novel and the series, but you know, given how much you've written about memory and Nothing Ever Dies, traveling around the world, going to Korean War, memorials for the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, and etc. You have an acute, very weighted sense of what memory means and how important it is and how it's glossed over. So dropping things from your own book in order to make a TV series must have been very hard. And that one question is just simply, how closely does the series follow the book? And I think another question there is just what was hard to give up?
Yeah, so Don and I broke down the book into 7 episodes. Although I told Don it should have been 10. We get paid per episode, but anyway, it was 7. So Park Chan-wook and Don thought, no, it's going to be 7 episodes. But I trusted the process. I mean, I think Park Chan-wook, the other co-showrunner, who directed half of the episodes, is an auteur. He's brilliant, and I had to trust Don's genius and director Park's on this. So there were things that were being changed and being cut and edited and so on. And I understand all of that as part of the creative adaptation and collaboration process. I would send Don notes, and then Don would sort of politely, say thank you for the notes, and then, not do allow all of them. But I think Don, did do the things that were most important to me. So the opening of the Sympathizer TV series, there's a few words that are the preface, because HBO wanted to say, well, HBO was worried people wouldn't know what the Vietnam War was, and they were probably right. Like again, the Vietnam War is ancient history. So I wrote the opening few words to the beginning of the series that people see, which are taken from my novel, from my book, Nothing Ever Dies. And then when I watched the very end of the show, I thought it was a great end, and it's so poetic, but a word was missing from the end in the draft that I saw, the visual cut, which was the word revolution. So I wrote Don a long email saying, "I love this, Don, but can we please put this sentence back that says revolution? Like I'm a revolutionary still in search of a revolution." And Don and Director Park got HBO to put that line in there. And so the whole nature of collaboration at this level is oftentimes about making compromises and hoping that the right compromise is made. And for me, I think I was satisfied with the changes.
This is a great point to ask a question from Maisie Horowitz, who says, "Do you think television has the power to revolutionize?"
Does television have I mean, in as much as any other art form does, I mean, you can ask that question of literature too. So, and that goes back to the notion of sympathy that we brought up earlier. Literature, TV, movies, they all have the power to move us, to instill in us revolutionary ideas. And by revolutionary ideas, I don't just mean like communism or something like that. There can be many kinds of revolutions that take place at the emotional and political level. But the issue would be, of course, what do we do with the feelings that are stirred up in us by the best of TV, movies, literature, stories, poetry, and so on? And that again is the problem of sympathy. Revolutions are born out of sympathy, but sympathy requires action in order to actually make a revolution happen. Then TV can't make us act. If anything, the actual form of TV encourages us not to act because we sit on the couch.
Mm. Rana Saba Hackman, who says, "Hello from Southern California. I've been reading The Sympathizer to my 86-year-old dad. We're Palestinian refugees multiple times over. We've had interesting discussions." I'm curious if, in the course of publishing The Sympathizer and the sequel, which you've mentioned, The Committed, which takes place in Paris in the 1980s and involves the history of colonialization that France inflicted on the other parts of the world, including Vietnam. Um, do you find that you have an endless amount of sort of fellow travelers that you didn't know about before?
I think that's probably a true statement. And the reason why there's an endless amount of fellow travelers is that the colonialism has been endless. I mean, Western colonialism, it took over so much of the globe and did all kinds of terrible things that are specifically different from one country to the next, but have a lot of formal similarities, which is why during, Israel's in my opinion, genocidal war in Gaza that's been unfolding since October 7th, there were so many connections and parallels I could draw between what happened in Vietnam and what was happening in Gaza. And of course, there is a whole history of relationships between the revolutionaries in Vietnam and and Palestinian revolutionaries. And when we recognize that things like military warfare and colonialism are really usually global campaigns of global strategies, we can see that particular national situations are not isolated from each other. So it was, but the depth of our ignorance or my ignorance is astonishing sometimes. So I'm going to El Salvador, and of course I'm going to El Salvador for the reasons I said, but also because I knew a little bit about what was going on in El Salvador because I was reading magazines and newspapers when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, and I heard these horror stories about U.S. trained soldiers massacring peasants and Jesuits and nuns and so on. But it wasn't until I started doing research that I discovered, well, after Jimmy Carter, cut off aid to the Salvadoran military and government in the late 70s because of human rights abuses, Israel stepped in and supplied the weapons. Israel was supplying 83% of El Salvador's weapons in a, partnership with the United States. So that's where the necessity for solidarity and discovering fellow sympathizers is really, really crucial. There's so many connections that many of us are not aware of, but they exist.
One of the comments right now is, "I thank you for writing The Sympathizer. It's the history of my colonized Puerto Rico." This is from Alvira Sofia Anaya Alegria. I think that now, speaking of sympathies, I want to bring on another novelist who probably can talk to you about not just this book, but the experience of having a book adapted, who is Ramana Alam, who has been waiting patiently in the wings before the most beautiful painting. who's also, many of you will know him as a critic, and is the author of 5 novels, including Leave the World Behind, which was up for the National Book Award a couple years ago. And may you always be up for the National Book Award, because it's great to see you. Why don't you take it away and ask Viet some questions here?
Yeah, well, I do sometimes work as a critic, and I had the opportunity to write about The Committed when it was published for the New York Review of Books. And to my great surprise, that magazine had not reviewed The Sympathizer, and it was sort of impossible to talk about The Committed without talking about the novel that preceded it. And so I tried to kind of talk about both of those books in my review. It's very daunting to face the subject of 2 books that you've reviewed, even on a friendly Zoom. Although my review, I don't think of reviews as sort of like buyer's guides, but I think my review makes it clear how highly I think of both of those books. Hearing you talk about television, about poetry, knowing, as John recited, you've published so widely in the past decade. But I wonder whether the novel doesn't occupy primacy for you, because you've turned out these 2 significant novels. And one of the points that I made in my review is that it struck me that The Sympathizer and The Committed are very much in conversation with some of the biggest texts in the American canon, with Catch-22, with The Invisible Man, and even to a lesser extent, but I think it's still salient, The Crying of Lot 49. So I wonder whether, like, what's your feeling about the novel as a form and what its potential is artistically?
Absolutely right. I think the novel has always preoccupied me. Although I initially wanted to be a poet. When I was a kid, I was seduced by poetry. I love the rhythms and the feel of poetry, and then, I just didn't have the talent for it. But the novel was the big thing, and that's almost a very 19th century idea that the novel was the big thing. But that's certainly I spent so much time reading novels and understanding novels intuitively as a younger person, and I've gravitated to it. And maybe this would be true for you too, but novels are my natural form. I don't know how to explain that, but I can't write poetry. I can write short stories, but they make me miserable, and I have tremendous fun writing novels despite the pain. So that's the form. But I don't know if I could have been the novelist that I am without also writing a bunch of other stuff. Some of the things that John brought up, my nonfiction, my scholarship, the memoirs, and so on, they allowed me to engage with some of the writers and thinkers that you have mentioned, and they've allowed me to think through my relationship to literature, to politics, to aesthetics, to my identity, to the history of the United States, and so on. So, I would certainly like to write more novels, but would I want to write as many novels as Philip Roth? And the answer is probably no. It's like I think I don't know what your eye is towards posterity, but I think any of us would be lucky to be remembered for 1 or 2 or 3 novels in the long run. And so the odds are if I write 10 novels, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 might be remembered. Writing 30 is not going to help me that much more. But writing a bunch of other things that help me write 10 better novels, I think that's been the project for me. And so that's why I think I like to call myself a writer more than I call myself a novelist, because it's the writing that comes first and the novelist part that comes second.
But you are very adept at the form, and as Don had pointed out, one of the most extraordinary things to me about The Sympathizer and The Committed are their sense of humor, their sense of play, their sense of fun. If I were working as a bookseller and sort of trying to hand this book to someone and say, like, okay, here's a great book about the conflict in Vietnam. Like, I don't know if that is a good sales pitch, and I don't know if that really explains this sort of texture or feeling of being inside these novels, which is so funny and so vibrant and just so alive. And hearing you talk before, it struck me as one of the kind of funny ironies of colonialism itself as a project, that this Vietnamese kid, ended up kind of mastering a form inherited from Ralph Ellison and Philip Roth. Like, it's kind of like funny that you've taken that as your tool to talk about the nation that is your home.
Sure. I felt that, the novel, I felt that literature was my way of belonging to the United States, and literature was my way of for me to explore myself, but also my relationship both to this country and to Vietnam, where I came from. Both of these are very complicated kinds of relationships. But if you look at these writers, some of the ones that you mentioned, they've used the novel precisely as their way of exploring themselves, their fictional personas, but also the very idea of belonging to the nation, to the culture, but then also to literature as a whole. And to me, that was always a more powerful form of belonging than national citizenship. I mean, citizenship has always been, I've always had ambivalent feelings about it. And the older I get and the more kinds of crimes that I see the United States has committed, both in the past but in the present, the less enthused I am about this whole idea of nation state belonging and citizenship. But
Yeah.
belonging to literature, belonging to art, belonging to my community of fellow writers and readers, that to me is enormously powerful. And that can never be a bad relationship. But the relationship to a nation, the relationship of one's citizenship to inherently compromised political efforts and mythologies and so on, that's something that I'm much more willing to renounce now than I was in the past.
Mhm. Don mentioned the sort of imperative of maintaining voice. Like there's such a powerful sense of voice in the sympathizer and in the committed. I wonder whether it's a challenge for you artistically to maintain an intimate relationship with that established voice as you head back into the third volume of that larger work, or whether it's a voice you feel total command over, or whether it will change as you write the next volume.
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much about the third novel, but it is hard to live with this character for as long as I have. He's a very, I remember my agent when he first read the first draft, he said, "This guy's not a very likable character, is he?" And my reaction was, "I like him." But there's that tension. He is a complicated person. He's very, very intense, but I do like him. But I am also aware of, the fact that the logic of his narrative drives him towards conclusions that will make it hard for me to stay in his voice for all the way through the entire trilogy. So I'm thinking through formal, structural ways of dealing with this. And again, I don't want to give away what I'm thinking about. But that's, as a writer, once I commit to a form, the form holds true. I'm in a first person narrative, I can't get out of the first person narrative. And so that's why some people read the sympathizer and they're like, "Oh, I don't like this guy because he's misogynist or he's sexist or whatever." And I'm like, "You're absolutely right, but I'm committed, so we have to see him through." And in order to see him through, that's why I felt one of the reasons why I wanted to write two sequels to grapple with his complications and contradictions in ways that were formally justified. It wouldn't have been true in the first novel for me to step out of character and say, "Yes, I'm sorry, he's a misogynist."
Mhm.
But his misogyny is a part of him and a part of the politics of war and colonization and revolution that I needed three whole novels to work through. So that is tied into the question of his voice. How do I be true to his voice, but also by the end of the third novel, subvert it as well? I want to talk to you though. We've never talked about your adaptation for Netflix of Leave the World Behind, which is, a brilliant novel, which had me gripped from beginning to end. I don't know, what was your experience working on that adaptation?
I think you sort of said something along these lines when you and Don were speaking, but it's a bit like you do have to cede the control. Like you maintain authorial control on the text of the novel. Like, you're dealing with your agent, you're dealing with your editor, you're making concessions or adjustments based on their feedback, but it's about shaping a book. But what someone like Don is doing is shaping something altogether different. And, the experience of reading a book, and especially a book like The Sympathizer and The Committed, like the voice is so intimate and so present in a way that a visual medium could never accomplish. And Leave the World Behind works very similarly. There's an authorial voice that is impossible to translate onto screen. I trusted Sam Esmail, who did the film. It sounds like you had a similar experience of trust with the creative collaborators, and understood that Sam's respect for the book was sort of his guiding star, and that he was going to make a film because that's what he does, but he was going to do it in service of capturing the atmosphere of the book. And I tried to just sort of trust in that, and I'm happy with it. And now at this point, it feels very removed from me. It feels like something that happened to me, that happened around my work, but is not my work, and I wonder if you feel that same, like I feel an intimate relationship to it, but a distant one as well.
Yeah, that was pretty much what I was going to ask you about. Like, does the fact that you have a TV series or we have TV series, do they now displace the books that we wrote, or are they separate creations altogether? It's very hard for me because, I know some writers, sell their books and then they have nothing to do with the project. And so in some ways they can treat the TV series or the movie as something completely different. But I was very involved in the
Hmm.
project. Because I really did believe that, TV is such a powerful medium, maybe not quite revolutionary as one of the audience members asked, but still, something that harnesses the power of capitalism and commodification and global circuitry to export stories so broadly. But one of the paradoxes or that have been really interesting to me is just encountering so many people who have said, well, you know what, we really love literature. The book still comes first. And that was actually
Hmm.
really affirming for me in some ways. Of course, there are other people, including people in the book world, who are like, wow, your book's now a TV series. Like they got all excited about it and they weren't as excited about the novel when the novel came out. So those contradictions are uneven. I don't know if you felt that way when you're
Yeah, and it's not your responsibility necessarily to do the hard sell of getting the book into the hands of every reader. And I think about the reader that I was when I was young and I didn't know anything. And so I had watched James Ivory's adaptation of Howard's End, and then I went to the library and I got Howard's End and I read the book and I was like, oh, this book is better. It's a great movie, but the book is better. And so books don't expire, they don't fall off of streaming platforms. They're always there in the library as long as this country maintains libraries, which is an open question. Um, but they're always ready to kind of receive you. And, people come into adulthood constantly. And so there are readers who are old enough now to read The Sympathizer who would have been kids when you were writing it. And that is sort of an extraordinary thing. And I just think for me, books have that primacy. I love films, I love movies, but books are where I live, I think.
you mean you brought the idea that they will always be streaming these TV series, and now I think maybe not. Like they have
Who
evaporated,
knows?
right? Like the erasure of cultural
Absolutely.
work has happened. And so we are in really a new world where we can't even depend on these things happening anymore. So, for example, one thing that I assumed, which is apparently not true, is that a TV series will always have a bigger impact than a book. I mean, I've gone around saying, oh, even a bad TV series will be watched by millions of people, and a good book might be read by, if we're lucky, hundreds of thousands of people. But now there's so much digital content out there that it's actually easy for TV series to be sort of lost and overwhelmed. And so, yeah, it's a different world than it was when I was watching TV in the 70s and 80s when everybody was watching TV,
Yeah.
and now you
Yeah.
can't.
When there were three channels, it was a completely different situation. Everybody was watching 60 Minutes on Sunday night with their family. It's not like that anymore. But I do think that is one of the principal attractions of the book. We're still talking about Joseph Heller and Philip Roth, and we'll probably talk about you.
Ramon, it's so great to see you. Thank you for coming
Yeah.
on. Uh,
Thank you.
there's a lot of questions piling in, Viet. I'm going to try to get to them as rapidly as possible. As Don, maybe you can jump in too, because some of these do address the series as well. But there's a couple questions about specific books and how you see yourself. One is, have you read a book called The Conformist? The book spoke more to the evolution of fascism in pre-war Italy, and I saw parallels to your protagonist. Bundled with that, I'll also ask, someone is asking how you see your books alongside fiction depicting colonial wars in Indochina, such as Tim O'Brien and others.
Ironically, sadly, I've watched The Conformist. That was a Bertolucci movie, I believe. It's a brilliant movie, but I did not read the book. So now I have to go. Now you caught me, so now I have to go read that. But yeah, I think that anybody who's lived under these regimes of authoritarianism or counter-revolution, counterinsurgency, there's a lot of similarities. Anybody who's lived under experiences of colonialism, there will find similarities. So one of the most affirming things for me is to get messages from people from very different places, saying, "Oh, I'm from Afghanistan, or I'm from Pakistan, or wherever, and this book spoke to me in some way or another because of these parallel colonial kinds of histories or moments of revolution and counter-revolution." I'm sorry, what was the second part of it? What was the second book that
Oh,
was?
someone was asking about Tim O'Brien and
Oh,
how you
right.
see your novel alongside the novels about war in
Yeah,
Indochina.
I'm teaching Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried right now, and my thing about this is that the Vietnam War for Americans is really interesting from a literary point of view because so much literature was produced out of this war. It's a very literary war, and we should be reading that literature. But I just it irks me when people come up with lists of the great Vietnam War novels and they're all by white American soldiers. Excluding, Bao Nin's The Sorrow of War, for example, from the North Vietnamese perspective, or Yung Tu Hung's Novel Without a Name from the North Vietnamese perspective, or any number of Vietnamese American or French Vietnamese works. So, all for reading Tim O'Brien and Michael Herr and all these other really canonical American writers about the war, but you definitely have to start including Vietnamese, Lao, Hmong, and Cambodian writers as well.
Yeah, I cannot recommend this book enough. I think it's if you were looking for a wider range of references of how the war in Vietnam was experienced, how it's remembered, how it's passed through time, been written into books and made into films outside of the US, I don't think there's anything even close to like it. And I was curious, Don, if when you were making this series, if there were tropes of films about the war in Vietnam that you thought I'm not gonna fall into that, or I'm gonna avoid that, or I'm gonna subvert that, that weren't already in Viet's book.
Yeah, well, of course, because as I'm making a TV show, and as you saw, the book explicitly references is the big section about this sort of movie, this sort of Apocalypse Now like movie, that I couldn't avoid all those sort of all that material. I played with our writers' room. I think one of the first things we did, kind of as a bonding experience, was played Heaven's Gate. And I looked through all that stuff and read all the books. It's impossible not to. I mean, I think that that's one of the really fun things about the book, that it effortlessly makes these references to other books and movies, and sometimes you don't even recognize it until you're thinking about it for a while. Say, oh yeah, that's just like something else. So yeah, sure, that was a lot of the fun.
One of the questions that had been lingering around is about Robert Downey Jr. playing three characters. And Viet, that to me, it seemed like the most amazing joke about how many films treat non-white actors as sort of interchangeable. Don, do you want to talk a little bit about that decision to cast him for all three?
Yeah, it's a big idea. I mean, as I said at the beginning, one of the things I was worried about was capturing the voice of the book. And I didn't want it just to be in the voiceover, like literally quoting the words from the book. I wanted it to be in the style itself. I wanted it to be in the form of the TV show. And that meant this kind of visual wit and this sort of playfulness that I think that the book has. So we were talking about that, Park Chan-wook and myself, and one day he said, what do you think if I had this idea, what if all these white patriarchal characters, because we've been talking about how they're these recurrent father figures who are all these sort of paternal mentor characters who all also lead them astray, and we didn't want it to be repetitive, and we wanted to be thematically unified like it is in the book. And he said, what if they were all played by the same actor, like Dr. Strangeglove, with Peter Sellers and Dr. Strangeglove? And I immediately loved it. We thought it was a really cool idea because it had a kind of cheekiness that I think the book has. We asked Viet, we were very worried what he was going to say. And he liked it right away, which is, and yeah, so it plays two ways, I think. It sort of makes it more subjective in a way because you think of them all as the same character reacting to the hero, but it also is, like you say, a bit of a flip on the joke about all these Asian characters looking the same in American movies and the sort of interchangeability of the Asian characters. We thought, why don't we do that with the white characters and make Robert Downey Jr. a supporting role? So that was the motivation.
It's incredible to hear this from behind the scenes. There's a great comment, Viet, from someone named Kyle Freudenberger, Freudenberg, who says, "My mother was born in 1962 in Saigon, the daughter of an American serviceman, and my Vietnamese grandmother. I always got the impression, given her trepidation to talk about her brief years in Vietnam, that she faced discrimination based on her mixed parentage. Is this something you've observed, as it was a point of contention for your protagonist? And do you feel like the protagonist's dedication to anti-imperialism and colonialism was a way for him to compensate for this?"
Absolutely. I mean, I'm well aware of the fact that there are many mixed race people in Vietnam because of the consequences of colonization and then the American presence there. And they were, as a whole, treated very badly. But they were treated much worse if they were descendants of black fathers versus white fathers. But regardless, whether you were Eurasian, Amerasian, and who your father was, you faced discrimination and racism in general. And I wanted to write a novel in which my character was mixed race because I knew so many mixed race Asian Americans when I was in university, and they all shared very similar kinds of stories about how out of place they felt no matter where they happened to be. And I wanted to use a mixed race character also to prevent people from reading this book and identifying purely with the narrator. I did not want Vietnamese people to read this book and say, finally, a novel about Vietnamese people. I was like, yeah, it is about a Vietnamese person, but he's a mixed race Vietnamese person. And bringing that up allows me to point out that racism is coming not only from the French and the Americans, but from within the Vietnamese people themselves. And they, that point was really, really crucial to me. And it goes completely over the heads of almost every Vietnamese reader who has ever talked to me. Like very few Vietnamese readers will bring up, oh, he's a mixed race character, whereas mixed race readers will always bring it up to me. And again, one of the things that I find really, moving for me is like how there's never been a mixed race reader who's come up to me or sent me a message and said, you got it wrong. They've always said, you get it right. And I thought that was so crucial, for me, going back to the question of sympathy, to be able to try to see from this point of mixed race view in order to destabilize so many inherent notions about what racial identity is and who we are.
I have a question here from Annabelle Chang that will relate to some degree to something Don has already said, but Rumaan, you might be able to weigh in. Since both of you are novelists and you're dealing with weighty themes, dualities within identities, the flattening of identity through cultural products such as movies, and the way that storytelling, whilst being exported, can sometimes reiterate those things or it can subvert them. And yet you also want to entertain. And Annabelle Chang says, "I read an interview that when coming up with the idea for the Sympathizer, you knew the book would be serious, political, and literary, but you also wanted it to be entertaining and reach a wide audience. How do you balance the two? And what were the hardest and most important parts to balance?" And Rumaan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Rumaan, you start.
Well, I mean, I can start by talking about Viet's books, actually, because I think that part of, again, when I was speaking earlier with my critic hat on, I really marveled at the authorial relationship to the extant literature and the ways in which he was having a good time. You can read a Graham Greene book. Like, the reason Graham Greene's books are so good is because they are spy novels. So those are fun to read when you're at the beach, and only as you get into it that you start to think, well, oh, this book is actually about like the Catholicism and all of this other stuff, and it's hidden in this form of the spy novel, which is the thing you want to read when you're at the beach. And that is what I think The Committed and The Sympathizer do so well, is that they do not neglect the imperative to entertain, which it should be something we ask of the novel. And actually, I think far too novelists provide it, in terms of a sense of humor and a sense of play and a sense of fun. I don't think that means, or I don't think that demeans the ability to talk about something important. If you have like a bawdy joke or a sex scene, it doesn't mean that the text is not serious about its themes or its interests. I think it's acknowledging the sort of demands of the novel as a form, that you're dealing with a reader and their attention, and you want to keep them going. You want to provide them a sense of story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I grew up, reading Graham Greene novels as a kid, so reading Our Man in Havana and The Power and the Glory and so on. And so I already had the sense that spy novels could be serious and entertaining at the same time. And then I got my hands on Catch-22, which we mentioned a couple of times, and I was like, oh, this is like very, very, very funny. And I was a teenager when I read it, and also it has something really important to say as well. So that was sort of the benchmark for me, is this idea that literature could do all these things simultaneously. And we shouldn't give up on that hope, you know. And you know, I think maybe too many writers, and Rumaan's sort of gesturing at that, maybe have given up a little bit on this idea that we can be serious and weighty and have all the complex thematics, but we can also be really, you know, crude and oriented towards entertainment and make jokes and engage in violence and all these kinds of things. And it's fun to write. I mean, it was fun for me to write these kinds of scenarios in the book. I think in your maybe your review, John, of my book, you said that there's a lot of well done violence in the novels, and yeah, I had such a blast killing people in and as I was writing. And you know, the corollary to that in the TV series is watching people get blown up on set. I wanted to get blown up on set. You know, I told Don I want to be blown up. I want to, but Don said no, it's too undignified for the writer to be killed on set like that. But
I always think that in the show is something we try to capture, is that the captain's sort of impulse to be entertaining when he's writing, to be his stylistic flourishes are kind of what keep him his bulwark against totalitarianism. It's what keeps it fights against the sort of this sort of doctrinaire binary fight that's going around all around. And so it's kind of what keeps him alive in a way in the end. That's what I said to our actor a couple of times.
I want to ask you one question about voice, Viet, and you know, because I think Don's and Park Chan-wook's series really captures the voice of the book, and I was really kind of almost fell out of my chair when I heard that you had studied with Maxine Hong Kingston, because I thought, of course, but I think people don't make the connection as much between your writing and what you care about and voice, because I think one thing you really have in common with Maxine Hong Kingston is the way that she uses voice and the way she assembles a voice in front of you on the page. And I wonder if you know, it's kind of remarkable to look at your history as an academic, and you started at USC in 1997, and then 18 years later, your first novel comes out, and you had two academic books. And so when your first novel comes out, it's like this voice comes out fully developed. It's funny, it's ribald, it's wise, it's smart. And you've talked in other places about making sure that your character could be the kind of person that says the kind of things that you want him to say. But what is it, do you think, that makes a voice? And what did you learn from Maxine Hong Kingston, if you learned anything about voice making?
and voice is a very mysterious concept, right? I mean, a lot of writers talk about voice and finding one's voice, and but no one can really teach it. That's the problem. And so when I was in Maxine's class as a 19-year-old, I was certainly trying to find my voice, but I don't think I can only speak about my own experience. You know, I don't think I could have found my voice without both a sense of discipline and maturity. And maturity can only be acquired through experience, and discipline can only be carried out over time. And so, you know, reading Maxine's work, she published The Woman Warrior when she was relatively young. I think she was in her 30s. But the voice in that book feels totally natural. It is Maxine Hong Kingston, but it's also this persona named Maxine. And it's a very magical moment when a writer can find their voice and their voice can carry them through. And for me, the voice seems to be an expression of one's own conviction, one's own character, one's sense of aesthetics, one's view of the world. And every writer will find their own voice at some undetermined time. In my case, it just took decades and decades. So, you know, theoretically, I understood what the voice was supposed to be, but like you said, it took 18 years from starting as a professor to being able to write that book. And the only way to really do that was to keep on writing. Other writers might find their voice in some other way, but and maybe Rumaan, you can talk about how you found your voice. But for me, it was just like writing, 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 and getting rid of all the things that weren't me, and looking into myself and looking deeper into my own emotions, and that's a scary that I found that to be a very scary thing to do. So the writing part, the discipline of writing was really hard, but looking into myself was even harder.
it's a problem with the sort of cultural preoccupation of being young and an imperative to feel like you have to begin young and dazzle when you are young. But as you say, it takes time and it takes discipline and it takes exposure. For me, less in terms of writing, but in terms of reading, you have to have a relationship to the literature that precedes all of us and understand like what you respond to and what you can leave behind, like what's not of interest to you or what's not salient to what you want to pursue. And I don't, as you say, I don't think there's a shortcut to that. I don't think it's that it can't be taught. I think it can be sort of, you can be apprenticed to that process. I just think it takes a really long time.
Don, in something like TV where there is a main character who has a voice who's giving a confession, it seems like there are two voices. There's the captain, his speaking voice, and then there's the camera, which is a voice in and of itself. And I wonder how you worked in making sure that they weren't sort of fighting each other.
Well, that's why I said that we really wanted his voice is not just his literal voice, but his voice embodies the style. That's why we wanted to show early on that he's capable of controlling the chronology and manipulating what's happening. We're literally seeing it through his eyes, even though it's not point of view in the traditional sense. So one of the reasons I was excited about this series was that Park Chan-wook, the director, such a brilliant stylist, that I thought he could create a style, a visual style or a voice similar to the captain's. So to me, we worked as hard as we could to keep them together, to make it clear that we're seeing it through this guy's point of view. And having Robert Downey Jr. play multiple parts was one of the little clues to that that sort of becomes, I don't want to give away for those who haven't seen the series, but it's sort of it's a sign that this is all quite subjective. So that, I mean, it was one of the big discussions. We talked about it an awful lot, but that was what we were shooting for.
The only other place I'd seen that recently was in the adaptation of David Mitchell's novel that the Wachowskis did. God, I'm forgetting. Hugh Grant played like 4 characters.
Yeah, in what is that? Cloud
Atlas.
Atlas, yeah.
Yeah. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I'm gonna have to ask one last question here. And it comes from Anna Sharp, which I don't think gives away too much of what you're going to do next, Viet, with the new novel. But she asks, as you write the final installment, how do you try to incorporate the captain's psychological development as a middle-aged man, especially leading a fulfilling life versus stagnation, or not focused on what other people think, and having a strong sense of who he is, while he's also going ever more deeper into a moral morass, I guess, if you will.
Sounds like my autobiography, middle-aged
I was
man
gonna
confronting his
say,
own bad
it's
choices and
core.
limitations. It goes back to this idea that earlier I said, once a form has been established, you have to follow it. Once you have a point of view and once you've created a character, you have to follow it. So, I mean, now that we have 2 novels with our captain, and I've inhabited him. He's got a psychology, he's got a history, he's a history of action as well. And he has to do what he's going to do is going to be very, I think, logical to his own development. And so in some ways, in some ways, I think, the 3rd novel is already predetermined in terms of his fate, what he's going to do and what's going to happen to him. I just have to be able and willing to follow him along, no matter how terrible that fate might be. But that's not the novel itself. I mean, the novel itself, how I choose to narrate the novel, if other voices come in, the structure of it, that's different. But I think the character has to, as in a Greek tragedy, meet his destiny.
Well, I'm so grateful that fate and destiny brought you to be with us tonight. We've been wanting to get you onto the show for a long time, and we actually thought about waiting for the 3rd book, and then we thought, no, we can't wait. This is too good. There's a series out. Don, it's very kind of you to join us, and you too, Rumaan.
Absolute pleasure.
Absolutely wonderful. if you've been watching and listening, some of the books we've mentioned are The Committed, which is the sequel to The Sympathizer, A Man of Two Faces, which is a memorial, a history, and a memoir. Viet Stories, The Refugees, Nothing Ever Dies, and of course, The Sympathizer. And if anyone else has Chicken of the Sea and Simone, I think you are winners of the Viet Thanh Nguyen Bingo Night. Blaze, I think you're lingering around out there to tell people where to go to maybe download the YouTube clip and maybe get a bag.
Oh
but
yeah. Well, I mean, thank you so much for tonight, Viet, Ramon, Don, John. Just extraordinary. I mean, it's already what 6:15. We've gone way over, but gosh, we could hear this forever. So great. A lot of people have been asking. Yes, tonight's program is being recorded. It will be posted very late or first thing in the morning. Come back to altaonline.com to watch it. We'll also send out an email to everybody with links to things that were discussed, all the different books, and so forth. So watch for that. Please be sure to mark your calendars for February 20th. That's next month when we'll be hosting Manuel Munoz with The Consequences. So look forward to that. And to close out, again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. We'd really be honored if you consider becoming a member of Alta Journal. You'll get our award-winning quarterly 5 years worth of laughs. This is Altitude. It's really a great cartoon collection. Back page of every issue has cartoons. Or check out, of course, our fabulous tote bag. There's all kinds of discount codes for California Book Club members. So watch your email for that. And then finally, we'd be grateful if you would participate in a 1-minute survey that's going to pop up as soon as this program ends. So if you could give us some feedback, we'd appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you in February. Stay safe. And thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Thanks, John. Thanks,
you.
Ramon. Thanks, Don. Thanks, Blaze.
Thank
Happy
you.
reading.
guys.